Conversation on race and policing began in response to the police killing of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020. In this partnership between CSU San Bernardino and the Brennan Center for Justice, we hope to engage in ongoing discussions related to the history and current context of race, policing, and criminal justice with guests from diverse academic fields and backgrounds.
Thanks, everybody, for joining Conversations on Race and Policing today. I want to start by thanking our hosts and our guests today, Madeleine Hamlin, for joining us from Colgate. And I want to also thank our tech support, Thin Lee, for keeping us going here. Thanks, everybody, for joining us online. And I'll pass over to Stan Futch of the Westside Action Group.
Good afternoon. I'd like to read the land acknowledgement. CSUSB land acknowledgement. We recognize that the California University of San Bernardino sits on territories and ancestral lands of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, Yuhavatam. We recognize that every member of this California State University San Bernardino community has benefited from the continued and benefits from the use and occupation of the land since its institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native people. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous people. And now I'll pass it on to Matt for the introduction of our guest today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Patino. I am an assistant professor of history at Crafton Hills College. I am also a former police officer with the city of Rialto. Today, we are in discussion with Dr. Madeleine Hamlin, who is an assistant professor of geography at Colgate University. She received her PhD in geography from Syracuse University and received an MA in geography and a master's in public administration from Syracuse also. Dr. Hamlin has previously worked as a policy analyst in Chicago, working specifically in the areas of public housing, police accountability, and criminal justice reform. And in 2021, she was named an emerging scholar by the Guggenheim Foundation and also received research support from a Society of Women Geographers Evelyn Pruitt Fellowship. Mouthful. She is an urban and carceral geographer whose work investigates the intersections of housing policy, race, class, and the carceral state in U.S. cities. She has a particular interest in how carceral power shapes the housing landscapes of the urban poor, something she will cover in her forthcoming book called Policing the Project, which traces how Chicago's public housing was policed over time, arguing that policing has played a heretofore under-examined role in the larger-scale privatization of public housing. In addition to the myriad ways that policing has shaped residents' experiences of everyday life. And if she wasn't busy enough, she is also the co-editor of a forthcoming collection called Keywords in Housing Justice, an international lexicon-style volume on housing justice research and praxis with contributions from scholars and activists from around the world. Dr. Hamlin, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be joining the conversation today.
Thank you. Go ahead.
All right. Well, I have some notes here, and I was thinking today to talk a little bit about my research on policing in Chicago's public housing, which, as Matt just mentioned, is the subject of my forthcoming book with the University of Chicago Press. Now, there has been a lot written already about public housing in Chicago, but with this book, I'm really trying to understand the relationship between policing and what many have talked about as the putative, quote unquote, failure of public housing as a program in Chicago as in other cities. To do so, I'm drawing on both historic and ethnographic fieldwork that I conducted mostly in 2020 and 2021. to examine how Chicago's public housing was policed over time, starting as far back as 1937, when the Chicago Housing Authority was founded, and up until about the year 2000, when the city announced its plan for transformation. So for those who are unfamiliar with the particularities of Chicago housing policy and history, the plan for transformation was a sweeping effort to redevelop the city's public housing by converting state-owned high-rises into privately owned and managed mixed-income communities that are typically low-rise buildings and condos. Now, as I said, there's already been a lot of really important investigation into the history of public housing in Chicago and elsewhere. And a lot of that work has been very critical of the sort of narrative of public housing decline. In other words, the idea that public housing was somehow doomed to fail based on some endemic flaw of the program. From my research, as well as extensive, from my archival research, as well as extensive interviews with both former public housing residents and former police officers who worked in Chicago's public housing, I join these critical historians, but argue that policing has so far been an overlooked factor in the decline of public housing in Chicago, and I suspect elsewhere, although my study really is a case study of Chicago, so I can't generalize too much. On a deeper level, I'm interested in the relationship between policing and what the geographer Sam Stein has termed the real estate state, a characterization that names the outsized prioritization of real estate interests in government today, and the extent to which our society is oriented around protecting and upholding private property relations. So as I argue that policing contributed to the downfall of Chicago's public housing over the course of the 20th century, what I'm really interested in is how policing, even if unwittingly or unintentionally, conditioned the limits of the public housing experiment and laid the conditions to remake public housing in the image of private property and in ways that were beneficial to the state and capital in the 21st century. So there are several dimensions to this argument, and I was hoping to just walk through some of my sub-arguments and give some brief examples. The first is that if we look historically, the Housing Authority and the Municipal Police Department in Chicago developed an extremely close relationship from really the very early days of public housing. As far back as the 1940s and 50s, police were called into public housing whenever there was any kind of problem, becoming the de facto mechanism of social control there, as they were in so many other contexts. In particular, however, police were called into integrating public housing developments when race riots broke out, most notably at the airport homes in 1946 and the Trumbull Park homes in 1953 and 1954. Trumbull Park is a really extreme example. So at that development, there were at times as many as 2,000 police officers stationed at the development, ostensibly to protect Housing Authority property and the Black families who were moving into what had been an all-white project. But they proved completely incapable of stemming unrest or protecting Housing Authority property. At times, reports show that the police frequently appeared to be even colluding with the rioters. And then, after this protracted period of policing, when policing seemingly failed to stem the racial unrest, police officials suggested that public housing be converted into private property. So, as early as the mid-1950s, not even 2 decades after public housing's inception, we have police and other city leaders suggesting that public housing was a failure that needed to be replaced with private development. They did not blame law enforcement for social unrest or the failure to control that social unrest, and instead blame was placed on the public nature of the housing itself. And this, I argue, really established a pattern for the dynamics that we're going to carry through the next several decades. So from those very early days then, police were called in to deal with any and every social problem in public housing. As I argue in the book, we really can't think of policing and public housing as abusive. I don't think that language goes far enough to capture how the population of public housing, which was nearly all Black by the 1960s, was policed on a daily basis in their home communities. Instead, policing itself was violent. It contributed to public housing violence as much as it responded to it. And I have a lot of examples, so I'm very happy to go into that more in the Q&A if there's interest. In the 1970s, 80s, and 90s then, to jump ahead a bit, the policing of public housing contributed to what I talk about as the prisonization of public housing, whereby residents began to experience their home communities as increasingly carceral, while policing also funneled public housing residents directly into the Illinois prison system through mechanisms of intensive surveillance, gang policing, warrantless raids, and so forth. I make this argument tentatively, and I want to be really careful here, because even as I argue that policing made public housing increasingly prison-like, I want to show how public housing was also always a really important site of home, domesticity, and familiarity, a place where residents talk about their neighbors as family members, where informal social controls that sometimes included gang hierarchies and territories enforced a sense of internalized order. And the history shows that residents always resisted policing in ways big and small, both formal and informal. From organized protests and marches to more vigilante forms of resistance, like setting traps for officers who were coming into the buildings or throwing things at police from balconies many stories up. Now, the last part of the argument that I'll highlight here is that policing in public housing was extremely expensive. And the cash-strapped Chicago Housing Authority, which faced federal defunding as early as the late 1960s, regularly transferred millions of dollars from its own operating budgets to the municipal police department, and later to its own in-house police force in the 1990s, to provide additional policing above and beyond what the city was already providing. And let's remember here, right, that Chicago's police force isn't small. It's one of the biggest and most militarized police forces in the country that takes up a significant portion of the city budget every year. So policing in public housing, in other words, came at the direct cost of building maintenance, social programming, and other expenditures in public housing. At the same time, outsiders were decrying public housing's high crime rates, crumbling infrastructure, and so-called culture of poverty. Now, there's a lot more to say here, but hopefully that gives a sense of some of my main arguments about how policing contributed to public housing's decline in Chicago in the 20th century. And that I argue, again, in line with other critical historians, was neither endemic nor guaranteed, but the product of compounding policy decisions and, in my case, police practice. In undermining the public housing program in these ways in the 20th century, policing, even if, again, unwittingly, helped usher in the privatization of public housing in the 21st century, effectively ushering in what the planning scholars Jeff Crump and Janet Smith, as well as the former HUD Secretary Henry Cisneros, have all called the end of public housing as we knew it. As such, I argue that police are crucial agents of the real estate state who centrally serve to uphold private property relations and the interests of real estate capital. Now, the last thing I'll note is that today we're 25 years on from the announcement of the plan for transformation, and much of the plan has never fully materialized. On the city's whiter and more affluent north side, much of Cabrini Green has been gentrified, the former Cabrini Green, I should say, turned into condominiums and box stores and a brand new police station, while very few former public housing residents have been able to return to live on site. On the south side of the city, in the shadow of the former Black Belt, where the Robert Taylor Homes and Stateway Gardens once stood, development has been really slow and piecemeal, halted by economic recessions and developers' inability to recruit higher income neighbors to move into the neighborhood. Large swaths of land now sit vacant where thousands of families once lived, while so many former public housing residents have merely been pushed into other low-income, majority Black neighborhoods of the city, where they now rent in substandard housing on the private market. This accounting raises some significant questions about who the plan was actually intended to serve, but it seems clear that whatever its intentions, public housing residents have not been the primary beneficiaries. For my purposes, I'm also interested in the plan's effects on crime, and here too, the results have been decidedly mixed. Police officers today tend to perpetuate what I think is a really damaging narrative, one that is also not backed by empirical evidence, that when the high rises were torn down, dispersed public housing residents spread crime around the city with them as they moved. Ironically, right, if demolition was in part justified by high crime rates in public housing, many officers will now tell you that the city is actually harder to police than it was when the high rises were standing. Again, none of this is really based in fact. It's a lot of hearsay and conjecture, but it does show that policy has substantively avoided addressing the root causes of crime and violence, as well as housing insecurity. And today, thanks to the work of journalists like Jamie Calvin, more and more is coming to light about police abuses in public housing. And again, abuse isn't quite the right word here, but for policy purposes, I think it's meaningful. The former Cook County State's Attorney, Kim Fox, who left office at the end of last year, exonerated several hundred people during her term, many of them former public housing residents who were falsely arrested by rogue cops who preyed on public housing tenants in late-stage public housing, planting guns and drugs on them, extorting a drug dealer tax, and so forth. This is nothing short of a human rights crisis. And as my work suggests, and as Calvin continues to investigate, we've barely scratched the surface of the problem, since so many officers were undertaking these kinds of practices in public housing for so many years. I hope that this gives at least a brief introduction and jumping off point for more conversation. Especially as my writing is still in progress, I'm really happy to take feedback on any of this and also to try to answer any questions you might have. So thanks once again so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hamlin. I have thought of several questions as you were speaking. And so you mentioned that public housing became Black. So it sounds like initially the first tenants were white. So my first question, at what point did the housing authority begin policing itself? When did they form their own police force?
Yeah. Let me just jot that down. Great. Okay, so the first question, which I really did skip over, is sort of about this racial transformation that took place. And you're absolutely right that contrary to its later image, public housing was really built primarily for white working families in the wake of the Great Depression. And then in the wartime era, there was a lot of housing built for war workers.
Right.
In segregated cities like Chicago, that housing was also segregated. So there was something called the Federal Neighborhood Composition Rule that dictated that public housing was not to be used as an instrument of integration. And so wherever public housing was built, it was mandated that the demographics of the residents reflect the demographics of the larger neighborhood. So if public housing was built in a predominantly white neighborhood, it had to be filled with predominantly white residents. And initially it was in cities like Chicago, again, highly racially segregated, strong aldermanic control. Aldermen typically vetoed the siting of public housing in majority white projects. And so that's how we ended up with getting a lot of particularly high-rise housing built in the 50s and 60s in the shadow of the Black Belt in these majority Black neighborhoods. In the few neighborhoods where public housing was racially mixed, there were often separate entrances for Black and white tenants. And again, this is in Chicago, right? This is a northern city.
Yeah.
I talked about race riots when Black families did integrate predominantly white developments, but that quickly shifted over time, right? So as Black families moved in, white families tended to move out. And as the historian Joseph Heathcote reminds us, we also have to keep in mind the prevailing context of what was happening to cities at the time. So once we get to mid-century, we're seeing a lot of suburbanization, a lot of deindustrialization. White families are able to access a lot of social and economic mobility that minority families are not. And so we get a lot of white families moving into the suburbs, jobs moving into the suburbs. And what's left behind, right, are a lot of communities of color left in the inner city in context now of widespread unemployment. So that's kind of how that shift took place.
Right. Yeah.
The CHA did not form its own police department until 1989, so relatively late in its history.
Yeah.
And it had about a 10-year run from 1989 to 1999. The force was formed by the then chairman and executive director of CHA, Vince Lane, who was a Black affordable housing developer who had been given sort of this dual role at the agency, which gave him wide power and control. He was not the first person to try to start an in-house police force, but he was the one who was able to actually get it off the ground. It required enabling legislation at the state level to create the authority, police department, and the agency had full police powers, including powers of arrest. Basically, the only police function they didn't do was traffic. So they carried weapons. They were trained at the Chicago Police Department, Police Academy. They worked very closely with the Chicago Police Department and at times other agencies like the DEA or the ATF or the FBI. They were small, so what I've seen shows that they never got bigger than about 500 to 700 officers, and they were focused mainly in a few of the high-rise developments. And they did not have their own lockup facilities. So they had a temporary holding facility that was actually in several of the developments. Just kind of, again, when I talk about the prisonization of public housing, it becomes quite literal in this moment. But then once someone was arrested in a holding cell, they would have to transfer them to the Chicago Police Department for booking.
So you mentioned the paramilitary culture that already existed with Chicago PD. The Housing Authority, they introduced their own PD very late in this, which I'm going to assume by what you were mentioning, by this point is all African American or predominantly African American and other minorities. So I wonder, I guess twofold. First, I wonder if there's any correlation or if you saw any correlation between crime when Chicago PD is patrolling these areas versus the housing police, who I would assume probably had a stronger relationship with the tenants.
Yeah, so the relationship, as you know, between crime and policing is very difficult to tease out, and crime statistics are notoriously unreliable. So there's not a lot conclusive that I can say about how crime changed over time, particularly when the media was so focused on crime and public housing in this very monochromatic way. And so at almost any time in history that you look at the record, that's really what the media is focused on in its portrayals of public housing. The Chicago Police Department had a complicated relationship and role in public housing, as you can imagine. So on the one hand, as I argue in the book, public housing was always one of the most intensively policed spaces in the city, with just tons of extra patrols, you know, off-duty officers, all of these task forces and special practices being piloted in public housing. At the same time, for decades, you had, again, primarily Black, heavily impoverished tenants complaining that when they had a problem, the police wouldn't show up. And so we can think about it as one of these spaces that's sort of paradoxically over-policed and underprotected, right? I know that's a phrase that Simon Balto and others have used to talk about policing. And so this sense was by 1989, and this was part of the justification for creating the Housing Authority police force, that they needed their own in-house force to respond to problems in public housing, a force that really understood public housing as a particular kind of space and a particular kind of population. I will say they did make an effort at the time to create a force that reflected the demographics of the residents more closely. And so the Chicago Housing Authority force was much more racially diverse than the Chicago Police Department was, at least at the time. They hired a few officers actually from public housing, but it was rare and very selective. And, you know, my ethnographic research, again, shows a really complicated relationship between the Housing Authority officers and the residents. Some residents really welcomed them and did feel this affiliation with them, whether racial or otherwise. A lot of the Chicago Housing Authority officers talk about residents as family, right? As people they got to know very closely because they were very embedded in those communities. And then other people will tell you that they were, you know, the most brutal officers out there and they were doing all the same things that the Chicago police were. Sometimes it's not clear that residents even fully understood or saw the distinction between officers on one force and officers on the other, right?
Right. I've never been to Chicago or spent any, you know, significant time other than flying through. So the only equivalency I can think of are some of the housing projects in New York, so the NYCHA properties.
Yeah.
You mentioned that some of these properties in Chicago had been torn down after the suburban white flight. I'm going to presume that these are in places, I'm thinking of New York. New York real estate is really expensive and very valued. Is it the same in Chicago? And
Yeah.
are they
It's
raising
re
buildings to create new communities?
Yeah, it's both similar and different. So New York City Housing Authority properties have been seen as somewhat of an outlier in US public housing. The high rises have lasted much longer. They've been much more fiscally stable than in other places. So I think that may be changing now. In Chicago, the high rises existed mostly until the mid 1990s to early 2000s, and that's when they started being torn down. In terms of where they were sited, it's really a mix. So there was a ton of public housing construction in, again, the State Street corridor or the former Black Belt on the city's south side.
Mhm.
And then there are a couple of developments on the much wider, more affluent north side, notably Cabrini Green and the Lathrop homes. Cabrini Green has gotten a lot of attention, in part, I think, because it's very proximate to downtown and what's known in Chicago as the Gold Coast, this really affluent neighborhood,
Yeah.
really, important commercial district for the city. And so it was literally visible. I mean, you could see the downtown skyline from the high rises of Cabrini Green, which set up this really interesting sort of spatial relationship. And in terms of what's happened afterwards, with the high rises being torn down, the former Cabrini Green area is significantly gentrified, whereas a lot of the neighborhoods on the south side have been significantly hollowed out. They just haven't been able to attract the kind of development or investment that planners had hoped for. And that's very much related to location and land value and everything else. So part of the argument that I'm making with the book, right, is that in areas like Cabrini Green, at a certain point, it really seemed like this losing proposition for the city where even if it wasn't conspiratorial, it made sense for the city to reclaim that land and rebuild property values there
Right.
to the detriment of public housing residents. And policing was something that I think facilitated that process.
I'm sorry, Stan, you're muted.
And where did the people go from Cabrini Green?
Yeah, so there were sort of two solutions or things that came out of high-rise demolition. One was mixed income redevelopment, which was basically turned over to the private sector. So the housing authority would partner with private developers, enter into long-term land lease agreements. So the land is still publicly owned, but private corporations came in and built new apartment or condo buildings with a set income mix. So usually about 30% or a third for market rate renters, a third for affordable renters, making 30 to 60% of the area median income, and a third for former public housing tenants. So this was at a time when there were not necessarily one-for-one public housing replacement laws. And so what it resulted in was a huge net loss in public housing in the neighborhood. And only some families were actually able to move back in, depending on whether there was an available unit for them, whether the units that were rebuilt met their needs, for example, in terms of bedrooms and housing type, and then whether they fit the newer, stricter criteria that private developers could build into the leasing and occupancy agreements. There's been a lot of criticism about how the plan for transformation was implemented, and particularly the fact that it took such a long time and the housing authority quite literally lost track of families in the process. So there's a lot of people where we just don't really know where they ended up because they got lost. And then many others were given Section 8 vouchers, or what are now known as housing choice vouchers, to find an apartment in the private rental market. And what studies have shown is that for folks who took the vouchers, many of them ended up renting in other poor, heavily minority neighborhoods, mostly on the city's south and west sides. So the critique there is that, we destroyed folks' homes and communities, and many people did not end up in much better situations, arguably, than what they started off with.
So in Riverside, what they've done is they've taken properties downtown and they've built apartments,
Hmm.
lots of apartments, some very, very large complexes. And what they've said is the same thing that you're saying is in Chicago, they had a third of them low income.
Yeah.
At the end of the rental of the properties, they found out that there wasn't a third. There was maybe one or two people.
Hmm.
Was Chicago true to its third of the property?
My understanding is that yes, that there were enough legal protections in place that they did have to lease up the set aside units for public housing residents to public housing residents. But again, the nature of those communities really shift, right? So, for example, once they moved back in, former public housing residents found that they were living in a very different type of community with very different norms and expectations than they had been previously. They understandably felt like they had a right to those communities because they've been living in those neighborhoods sometimes for generations. But then all of a sudden, they're getting sort of informally policed by higher income neighbors who object to things like barbecuing in common spaces, right? Having block parties, things that were commonplace at Cabrini Green.
And that was one of the things I was going to touch on is you were saying how the people in those communities before they were demolished and taken away they had things in common.
Yeah.
So their things in common brought them together. And one of the things I would assume in common that they didn't like was policing.
Mhm.
And so a lot of them, like you said, had lookouts and so on and so on. And of course, the drug dealers didn't want the cops in there anyway. And
Right.
and then but what that does, and the lack of policing, you said sometimes they had the numbers, but they weren't there, and the
Right.
lack of policing left, I would think, would leave the strong survive.
Yeah. I think that's right. And, I think what research shows is that there were very, very strong community ties in high-rise public housing that were sometimes difficult for outsiders to understand. And that's not to romanticize the situation because there was a lot of hardship and there was a lot of deprivation at these sites. And so, I don't want to erase that or whitewash it either. But there were very clear sort of informal hierarchies. There were mothers and aunts in the community who sort of had eyes on the street and were looking out for everyone. Um, and as much as outsiders feared the gangs, residents will talk about police as operating very akin to a gang in their neighborhood, right? And particularly targeting young men in the community for harassment and abuse, and that was just sort of a part of daily life. It was something that many residents were united against, but I also want to acknowledge that there's some nuance there. And so some residents at the time continued to call for more policing in the community, seeing it as sort of the only avenue available to achieve public safety. And even today, residents express very different perspectives on what the police were doing in public housing. And so that's part of what makes this, to me, interesting, but also complicated to study, right? Is that none of these groups are monolithic or homogeneous. There's always a diversity of perspectives there.
Thank you.
So you mentioned something about whether or not you want the police there. Did it ever reach a point where they self-policed? They created their own vigilante or own in-house force?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I mentioned the very common practice, certainly by the 1980s, of sort of having lookouts for the police and watching and throwing things either at officers or at their cars as they approached the building to keep them out. There was also, this is more formal perhaps, but the housing authority actually maintained a tenant police or tenant security program for a while where again, primarily women in the community would be hired on as tenant patrollers and given a uniform, and they were instructed to walk the buildings. And they were not armed, they had no powers of arrest, they were not formal police officers, but they were in sort of this very Jane Jacobs way, right? Eyes on the street, and they were known by everyone in the community. And to me, this is actually a really interesting model of like the best version of community policing, right? Because I've had former gang members who I interviewed for the study tell me you know, you really couldn't get away with walking down the hallway with a big gun if your auntie was out there watching you, you know? And so it was, in some ways, again, not to like overstate it or make it sound like a silver bullet, because it certainly wasn't perfect, but was this really interesting model for what community policing could look like, and who was versus wasn't respected as an authority figure in the developments.
For those listeners who are completely unfamiliar
Mhm.
with public housing, you mentioned that there were high rises and then there were other properties, and the other properties, I think, LA cinder block kind of duplex looking things. Is that what Chicago also had?
Yeah, so Chicago also had a lot of low-rise row houses, some scattered site public housing, which I actually don't cover in the study, and then the high rises. And the high rises have gotten the majority of attention, both in scholarship and in the media, um, probably for good reason, right? I mean, again, they're this sort of extreme case. And I think a lot of housing policy has been formulated sort of against the high-rise model of public housing, for better or worse. But there were certainly low-rise developments, and you know, I tend to be critical of arguments that place too much emphasis on design itself, urban design, as either um, encouraging crime or making a space difficult to police, right? For example, we would never say that a luxury high rise is criminogenic because of the design aesthetic there, but we're so quick to say that the public housing high rises were criminogenic or lacked what the architect Oscar Newman, right, talked about as defensible space.
Right.
At the same time, there have been at different times significant problems with crime in low-rise developments. And so I don't think there's anything particular about the spatial form that was determinative of crime and violence or how they were policed. And again, the police narrative has also shifted, at least from what I found in my research, from, you know, oh, the high rises were just totally lawless and so difficult to police,
Mhm.
and it was so dangerous for us to come into them because it was almost like a reverse panopticon where residents could see the
Mhm.
police coming as they
Right.
approached the buildings. But then after they get torn down, the narrative totally shifts to, well, then all the violence and all the gangs were contained in one spot, and it was really easy to police. And now we don't know where anyone is, and it's just spreading violence all over the city. And, you know, in this very problematic sort of uh, description.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to that.
Mm.
I want to flip though the question about design. So for the police to say, you know, okay, maybe this leads to criminality or not. Did residents in any of your interview with residents, did they feel that like the design was carceral?
Yeah, and again, this is sort of where I walk a really careful line, because these were such important domestic spaces. And at least when they were built, I think they were genuinely built with great intentions to be these really modern, efficient spaces that replaced the slums and gave
Mhm.
people amenities like refrigerators and stoves that they, you know, hadn't had in past housing conditions. Um, and the fact that they declined to the extent that they did, I really do see as an unfortunate result of compounding policy decisions made at the federal and local levels, that, you know, defunded public housing, led to a lot of deferred maintenance. I do think that policing was a factor there. And so what you see over time is, you know, the construction of more and more sort of security architectures in the building. So the breezeways that were supposed to give residents access to clean air and sort of
Yeah.
outdoor space, even in a high-rise context, become this very sort of carceral structure that's gated in with, you know, not barbed wire, but
Right.
mesh sort of fencing, and it looks very austere, right? And there's a lot of graffiti as time goes on. The trash collection breaks down. The elevators are constantly breaking down and being vandalized. And this is something that residents complain about all the time, especially if you have to walk up to the 14th, 15th, 16th story of a high rise. So and right, the housing authority is spending so much money, not just on policing in terms of foot patrols, but the installation of closed circuit TV cameras in public spaces, the installation of security booths in the lobbies, you know, turnstiles, all of these measures to ostensibly keep residents safe, But what I argue it also does is it essentially criminalizes public housing residents as a class, right? By virtue of living in public housing, you have to go through all of these extra security checks just to get into your apartment. You have to deal with warrantless searches conducted before dawn. You have to be issued IDs. There were constantly shifting policies around guests and visitors. And those are things that just most of us who rent on the private market don't have to deal with.
Right.
One of the things we found over the course of this series is the big thing with most departments is I want to increase my number of officers. So I have two questions. One, did the housing authority officers, once the houses were torn down or people moved on or they did away with it, did most of those become police officers for the city? That's one. Secondly, at one point, did the officers decide, instead of endangering myself and going into this complex and dealing with the issues, I'm just going to keep these people in this box so they don't mess with people outside the box?
Yeah. So I'll answer your second question first. I think that's absolutely right. And it would be hard to get anyone to say that in a straightforward way, right, in an interview, but that was very much the sense I got. And the journalist Jamie Calvin has also argued this, that for a time at least, public housing almost operated as a containment zone for the city, containing vice, containing drug dealing. And it was seen as a way to sort of keep certain categories of crime concentrated. Again, it's a little bit difficult to tease out how much was public perception and the media really dramatizing what was happening in public housing or focusing exclusively on the sort of negative activities in public housing versus how much of that was really going on. But I do think there was that sense of almost cordoning it off, keeping it in a particular space. In terms of what happened once the Chicago Housing Authority Police Department was dissolved very quickly in 1999. Officers of the force kind of saw the writing on the wall of what was going to come with the demolitions, with the change. They knew they were going to be disbanded. And so most of them actually called in sick in a blue flu in the final days of the department. And so they did not end things on good terms with the housing authority. I think most of them were expected to be hired by the Chicago Police Department, but there were some simmering tensions and competitions for a long time between those two police forces. And so as it happened, very few of them were actually hired into the Chicago Police Department. And that was another thing that those officers were really upset about, because they had trained right at the Chicago Police Department Academy. They'd worked alongside those officers. They felt very entitled for a job with the Chicago Police Force. And instead, Chicago police said, no, thank you. We're not that interested in absorbing you. But then immediately turned around and made the argument that because that force had been disbanded, they needed to hire more officers themselves. So you're absolutely right that about how the dynamics worked there.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mike.
Hi, excuse me. Hi, Dr. Hamlin. Sorry, I was late to the broadcast, so we weren't introduced before. But unlike Matt, I did spend some time in Chicago, going to Northwestern Law School, which
great.
was only about six or eight blocks from Cabrini Green.
Yep.
And I think your description of it as a carceral situation was exactly right. And you knew you were getting close when you saw the police cars that lined the blocks around. There wasn't a physical wall, but there was a wall of police.
Yeah.
But what was also fascinating that I'd love for you to comment was how it was used in rhetoric. I think you're right, because it was visible. It sort of fueled the militarization of police, the idea that there is a crime community that is there and that the police are designed to protect us from them. And this was in the mid 80s, so you may remember the stunt of the mayor moving in to Cabrini Green. But can you talk about how that was used as kind of a justification for political policies, rather than anything to help the community, certainly, but even to help the broader community so that they interacted in a way that was helpful and productive rather than just us and them?
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm really critical of the media portrayal of public housing, but particularly of Cabrini Green in my book. It just became exceptionally clear to me looking through that archival record. I think I pieced together 1,800 newspaper articles from Chicago area newspapers from 1937 to 2000, looking at crime and policing and public housing. And the coverage is just so monochromatic and so, in my opinion, dramatizing at times. They would do things like interview an officer walking the beat at Cabrini, and it just regularly over the decades gets called things like Little Hell, right? It gets compared to foreign wars that were going on. So the press would compare it in the 90s, for example, to Bosnia, right? In terms of the conditions there. And also in more prominent public discourses, right? So we can think about Cabrini Green, for example, as the setting of the horror film Candyman. It really takes on this much broader, I would say, national significance as sort of a metonym for urban crime and violence that really transcends anything that was happening on the ground. Candyman was based on a story that had been written about, I think it was Liverpool, England, in public housing, but the filmmakers decided to relocate the horror story to Cabrini Green in the 1990s. And I don't think that's accidental, right? It was really the site of sort of all of these urban legends and urban myths, and so much fear and violence and stigma, right? So the sociologist Louis Kant talks about the idea of territorial stigmatization, where a place takes on a particular stigma, but then it gets extended back to the residents, and the residents get really embroiled in all of the negative imagery associated with a particular place. So I hope this is answering your question and I'm not getting too off track. But yes, I think that it became that of all of the high rises, and my book does look citywide, the Cabrini Green development got an outsized amount of attention due to its proximity to downtown, due to the way that the media wrote about it, due to the way that it got picked up in film and TV and music. I mean, it just got regularly referenced, right, as this sort of shorthand for urban crime. And as a result, was also a particularly intensive site of policing. Absolutely.
Property values. So now we've gotten rid of these places, and like you said, on the one side of town they didn't rebuild, and no one's interested in the property. But Cabrini Green, I'm sure people jumped all over that property. Now, so the dismantling, was it timely financially to dismantle?
I think so. You know, it's always hard to predict exactly when and where gentrification is going to take place and when it can. But by the 1990s, there was this perfect storm, right, of the stigma that a site like Cabrini Green had taken on, the sense that decades of increasingly intensive policing had failed to secure the development. So Vince Lane, when he created the Chicago Housing Authority Police, his whole thing was, I can't do anything good for public housing until I get public safety under control. So policing was really his number one mission as the head of the housing authority. So again, we can see sort of the blurring or the mission creep that happens. He's an affordable housing developer. He comes in and all of a sudden he's the head of his own police force, because to him, that is the most important priority in public housing. So all of that's going on. There is, I think, by the late 1990s, a sense that policing is incapable of controlling public housing and its residents. And rather, again, than blaming policing, the state blames the public housing program itself as just a complete failure, an intractable problem, a stain on the city. This is also around the time of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, the ascension of the Bulls, which becomes important because there's a lot of redevelopment happening around the United Center, where both the DNC convention was and the Bulls are playing. So there's a lot of intensive attention on the city. And at the time, I argue in the book, this real obsession with public housing crime really jumps scales. So the 1990s, again, is the time when Bill Clinton is campaigning for his omnibus crime bill that gets passed in 1994. He visits Chicago public housing as kind of a stop on his campaign. He sees one of the Chicago Housing Authority lockup rooms. He sees all of the guns they've allegedly confiscated, and he gives this sort of like radio press announcement about the horrible conditions and why his crime control bill is going to get all of this under control, right? And so all of these factors are converging at the same historical conjuncture that also, as you point out, is a point in time when it becomes very clear that this is an area that is ripe for gentrification, a place where it would be advantageous for the city to recapture property values, a classic sort of what geographers talk about as a rent gap, right? Neil Smith's idea of a place in the city where rent values are lower than they would be if the area were to be redeveloped. And so for all of these reasons at the time, the 1990s is just this moment where it all comes together, and it becomes very clear that the moment is ripe for demolition and redevelopment. There's never any talk of rehabilitation. The sense is that the buildings are too far gone, they're too severely distressed, and it would take too much money to rehabilitate them. What I hope my research does is trouble that narrative at least a little bit and say, well, maybe if we hadn't been spending what we were spending on policing and security, we could have kept the buildings in better shape. It wouldn't have been so expensive. Maybe rehabilitation wouldn't have been off the table. Things could have been otherwise, right?
We have a question from the Q&A. This is from Delphine, who grew up in Washington, D.C. and wants to know, can you share a little bit about the housing in that area? She lived in the Northwest area, always lived in a home, and does not recall many apartments other than in the Southeast area of the city.
That's a great question, and I'm not sure I can answer it well. I am not an expert on Washington, D.C. I do know that they are a city that has some public housing, but again, in sort of very specific pockets. So it makes sense that depending on where you lived, you may or may not have come into contact with it. And to my knowledge, a lot of that public housing has also been torn down and redeveloped. And I know DC is a very, very tight housing market. And so there's been a lot of sort of contested politics around that. Beyond that, I'm afraid I can't shed too much light on that specific city.
So I have a question to, I guess, follow up on your answer to Stan. As gentrification moves through a city, and again, I'm thinking of New York. I'm thinking of the expansion of Columbia University, which has reached all the way up to 125th Street. They have a brand new building on Broadway, and directly across the street is a NYCHA project, which, if you didn't realize it was a NYCHA project, you didn't see the signs, you might not even realize that it was. It just looks like another apartment building. But you go up 25 blocks or 30 blocks to 155th, that's a project. So I wonder, did Chicago do this kind of thing? Did they sort of gentrify, and I'll put that in quotes, gentrify around the United Center, or where they were going to be more visible, and leave other properties to just decay?
You know, I think it's a little bit hard for me to draw a direct comparison without being more of an expert on New York City housing. But I think in Chicago, the story was a little bit different. I think that there, at least, the buildings were all, for the most part, allowed to fall into disarray. And so the sort of blanket solution became demolition and redevelopment. It was never so much, let's leave this piece here, let's keep this part looking nice because of what's around it. The Lathrop homes maybe are a small exception to that. They're also on the north side. They're currently being redeveloped into mixed income. They were a historic property right on the riverfront, developed as low rise. And I do think that they suffered their fair share of infrastructural decay, but they were sort of left alone for a bit longer. There are a few other examples as well. But for the most part, it was sort of a blanket policy of demolish and redevelop.
Okay, well, we are very close to our hour. Any other questions from the panel? Mike.
You had mentioned it in your talk early on that you could highlight some of the abuses, and
Oh, yeah.
typically when we talk about abuses, they're the over policing type of abuses that we see. But Chicago police has had some really incredible scandals, and there was more recently a scandal where a police unit was actually dealing drugs. And in addition to setting up people and being violent, they were actually involved in distributing drugs and doing the things that they were supposed to be policing. And I think that attacks the narrative that of that more police are necessary to address this crime. And of course, for the community, their idea of the police is not somebody who's going to come and help us, but rather just another element that's preying on our society. Can you talk about how that corruption and the exposure of that corruption has changed the dynamic, or has it changed the dynamic in how these issues are discussed in the public housing context?
I think it's starting to change the dynamic. And I give all credit here to the journalist I mentioned, Jamie Calvin, who I'm always in close conversation with, because he's really the person who did the investigative reporting and broke the story on, I think, the unit that you're talking about, Ronald Watts and his partner, Khalid Mohammed, who were policing primarily in and around the Ida B. Wells homes on the South Side. Again, in that very late stage of public housing, mostly in the early 2000s, when everyone sort of already knew that demolition was planned and the state was just totally hands off. And from what I can tell in my research, these kinds of practices were fairly widespread beforehand, but in that particular moment, there was so little oversight. And Calvin has argued that the city had the means to know and were sort of turning a blind eye to what was going on, allowing drug dealing, extorting a drug dealer tax. So basically, failing to arrest drug dealers in exchange for skimming off the top of their products or their profits. And they were eventually caught and sentenced. They were given a relatively brief sentence for their crimes. And as I mentioned, many of their victims have been exonerated, but probably not all of them. And we know that there were other officers undertaking similar activities who have not been caught or convicted. So I think it is beginning to change the way we think about policing and public housing. Another important thing to keep in mind that Jamie always reminds me is that there was what's known as the one strike rule in public housing, which meant that if anyone on the lease, or even not on the lease, any member of the household of a public housing unit had basically any contact with the criminal justice system, even a simple arrest, it could trigger an eviction for the entire household. And so that means that if your grandson is staying with you and he's caught with a dime bag of weed, the whole family can be arrested. What that presumes, and I'm really drawing on Jamie's thought here, is quality policing at the front end, right? You have to have good policing, if there is such a thing, right, in order to make the basis for that kind of arrest and eviction, which is a very, very punitive practice. Again, much more punitive than we see in private market housing. Because again, there's no need for a conviction here. Just the simple arrest can trigger the eviction. What we now know, right, is that there was often not quality policing. There was this very corrupt and abusive policing taking place. And then that policing in turn is being used to facilitate widespread evictions in this moment where the housing authority is preparing to tear down the developments. And again, I don't mean to suggest that this was somehow conspiratorial, but I think it was a lot of factors coming together at the same moment in a way that worked very efficiently for the state and capital.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to your book, and hope we can have you back again in the future
Absolutely.
with another book.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed the discussion and questions today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hamlin.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Conversation on Race and Policing has been supported by funding from the California State University, San Bernardino College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Pfau Library, and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Then Lee is our technical consultant. Pamela Crossan provides administrative support, and Alan Yorbach provides communication support. There's more information in the show notes, and please join us online at csusb.edu/CORP for upcoming programming, and find our catalog of over 100 past events with guests like Robin D.G. Kelly, Jamal Bowman, and Dorothy Roberts, and many more.